There are a lot of valid debates when it comes to housing affordability, like the role or design of rent control, and how to balance heritage preservation and new construction. But at the same time, there are some pervasive ideas out there that just don't reflect reality, which ultimately lower the quality of the debate and end up stopping any change from happening.
The first bad idea is that new housing must be affordable to help affordability. Many people think that a new housing development that's mainly accessible to the higher end of the income spectrum doesn't help, or maybe even hurts overall affordability. The problem is that new housing is usually more expensive than older housing, all else equal, but you still need to build new housing now to have older housing later. On top of this, blocking new housing for higher income households doesn't necessarily make these people disappear or move away. It does set them up to compete with middle and lower income households over the existing housing stock, though. This doesn't just apply to housing. If you want a budget laptop, one of the best options is a used ThinkPad. Companies buy them in large numbers for business purposes, and then sell them off after 3 to 4 years when they upgrade, leaving the used market flush with supply. The result is that you can buy an older but very reliable business quality laptop for $200 to $400. Imagine if we banned or restricted the sale of new ThinkPads or MacBooks, under the idea that we need supply, yes, but the right kind of supply, not luxury laptops. This would immediately increase demand for older models, and gradually decrease supply of them, a recipe for making them less affordable. We actually saw something like this in the pandemic, when supply chain disruptions led to a shortage in new cars and bikes, which inflated the market for used models too.
Leanne Thompson owns Fort Myers Automall. She says the computer chips that run our cars aren't being made fast enough. There are less new car options, which is creating a hot market for used ones.
This is sometimes derided as trickle-down economics, but it's backed up by evidence. A recent study from Finland followed moving data and found that new market-rate construction loosens the housing market in middle and low-income areas, even in the short run. Of course, while we shouldn't block new housing just for being expensive, we can and should implement policies to encourage more new housing at lower price points too, like supporting nonprofit developers with land or money, and broadly eliminating rules like parking mandates that drive up the cost of budget housing.
The second myth is that housing doesn't actually follow supply and demand. Sometimes people say that market rate housing can't be affordable because developers or landlords have no incentive to let it become affordable. But this doesn't explain why some cities are much more affordable than others. Developers, landlords, and home sellers always want to charge as much as they can. They'd all love to charge Vancouver or San Francisco prices. What constrains them is local market conditions in their city, how many people want to live there, and what other housing options exist. One American study found that U.S. housing markets fall into 3 main clusters. First, cities like Detroit have low demand, low construction, and low housing prices. Second, cities like San Francisco have high demand, low construction, and high housing prices. Finally, cities like Atlanta have high demand, but this time they respond with high construction, and as a result, they have relatively affordable housing. For more fine-grained evidence that supply and demand applies to housing, a housing market analysis from the U.S. found that periods with low inventory available for sale see bigger price increases. An analysis of apartments in Canada finds the exact same thing. Low vacancy corresponds to higher rent increases. The Smart Prosperity Institute has linked the explosion in home prices in southern Ontario to a specific government failure to predict and plan for population growth in Greater Toronto, which led to an exodus of people, especially families with children, to surrounding cities. It's understandable that people in very unaffordable cities feel hopeless about housing costs, but if you take a step back, it should be clear that the level of unaffordability that they're experiencing is not inevitable.
The third bad idea about housing is that home ownership is everything. Tons of people identify the source of the affordability problem as property hoarders owning multiple properties. They propose bans on corporate ownership of housing and on individuals owning too many properties. This actually sounds appealing at first, but the problem is that this is where rentals come from. Lots of people are laser-focused on owning as the singular legitimate way to occupy housing, but eliminating the rental market or inflating its prices would actually be pretty awful. Renting gives you access to housing without needing to qualify for a mortgage or commit to a down payment. Even if you have the money, tying your finances to one illiquid asset in one housing market is in fact not always a good idea. Owning also makes it harder to move for job opportunities. Renting obviously has downsides too, but that doesn't justify a policy of suppressing rentals. That's what wealthy municipalities often do to exclude people. Sometimes people arguing against property hoarders will respond that renting should happen through a government or nonprofit. Building more social and co-op housing to increase options for renters is a great idea, but banning private rentals in order to switch housing stock over to the buying market is fundamentally a policy prioritizing buyers without giving much thought to the significant portion of the population that rents. We're not saying there's no room for policy tweaks here. Maybe it should be harder to borrow against one property to buy another, but so often discussion simply forgets that renters exist and matter.
The fourth bad idea is that new housing won't help because it'll just get scooped up by investors. This shows a weird discrepancy in how we think about new versus old housing. Investors are in fact entirely capable of buying homes that were built 5, 10, or 20 years ago, but no one would suggest that we ban existing homeowners from selling their homes because there's no point. It'll just get snapped up by investors. That's because it doesn't make sense. Investors don't buy anywhere near 100% of housing, new or old. The numbers that scare people are headlines like 40% of Toronto condos not being owner-occupied, but that still leaves a majority of units lived in by their owner. Additionally, do you know who lives in units that aren't owner-occupied? Renters. The idea that new housing doesn't count because of investors is wrong on so many levels.
Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget that when you don't have enough pizza, you need to make more. And subscribe. A special thanks to our supporters on Patreon.